dear Deputy Vice Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. So I saw on the list of the Hugo Valentin Lectures, and I saw that I'm the third German in a row, not in a row, but the third German among these lecturers. And probably the Germans are especially suited to talk about violence, genocide, and conflict, but I don't know. This is now scientific culture. I want to thank you for the invitation, and it's a special honor for me to be present on the occasion of such a distinguished lecture series. The purpose of my presentation in the next approximately 50 minutes is to give you a perspective, I think a specific and might be even somewhat new perspective on the 2 decades which were the most violent ones, not only in the 20th century, but I think in all of history. Though mass violence, as you all know, continued after the 1940s in China, in Cambodia, and elsewhere, and even though almost 40 million Chinese men, women, and children were starved to death in this great leap forward, how it was called in the People's Republic of China, I think the 1930s and the 1940s remained the most extreme period with almost unprecedented mass murders, especially by Nazi Germany, but also by the Stalinist Soviet Union and others like militarist Japan. For a long time, historiography has dealt with these complexes very isolated. They have kept the cases separately, focusing on the one side, of course, on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, but since the 1990s also on the Stalinist crimes, and rather to a limited extent, especially in the West, on militarist Japan and even fascist Italy. An enormous amount of publications has been produced, especially over the last 25 years. If you look into the online library catalog of Yad Vashem, the Israeli Commemoration and Research Institution, they currently host 130,000 entries, books, articles, and so on, and that's not everything. Since the end of the war, historiography and other disciplines have interpreted this collapsed civilization, pointed at different explanations, the most common of which is singling out radical ideologies. The prevalent narrative on the origins of the central crime of the century, the Holocaust, starts with the formation of modern political anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria at the end of the 19th century, then follows the Nazi movement's rise to power and the steps of its radicalization, beginning with the 1933 terror, the war against Poland, 1939, a start of mass murder, and the attack on the Soviet Union, which was accompanied by the beginning of the systematic annihilation of European Jewry. In a more traditional analytic perspective, this has been interpreted as some kind of unfolding of a more or less stable ideological program, which step by step led to the catastrophe. These interpretations were both augmented and challenged by arguments focusing on other contexts, like the logics of Nazi dictatorship, the dynamics of militant organization like the SS or the Nazi Party, a kind of permanent revolution which radicalized the system. More and more, German society as a whole is seen as the most important structure which enabled the violence. Newer interpretations, however, tend to focus on geopolitical structures which were underlying the German onslaught. Ethnic conflict and zones of violence which were occupied first by the Soviet Union, then by Germany, whether we call them now borderlands, bloodlands, or recently even rimlands, that is the stretch between the Baltics in the north and the Black Sea and the Adriatics in the south. Finally, in recent years, the Holocaust is being put in the perspective of all 20th century's genocides. This approach has broadened the comparative analysis, but in my opinion not decisively altered the interpretations on the origins and the logics of the Holocaust. However, certain continuity came into focus, the one between colonial violence and the Holocaust, either as a continuity of the German colonial crimes committed in Africa between 1904 and 1907, or rather as a general colonial discourse which was adapted by the Nazis. In this presentation, a slightly alternative approach is offered, which is connected to the mentioned perspective. I think it is obvious that the most interpretations of German wartime violence seek to analyze the Holocaust, the persecution and murder of European Jews. All other types of German crimes are dealt with separately, like the murder of European Roma, the mentally ill, the war crimes, especially against the Soviet POWs, or the mass killings during the radical anti-partisan warfare. Since the Holocaust was entangled in these crimes, or sometimes was even preceded by them, a general interpretation should seek to integrate these, not the least in order to enable comparisons, both on a micro and a macro level. There's an abundance of macro comparisons of genocides and dictatorships like Nazism, Stalinism, Italian fascism, but apparently only few coherent interpretations of all mass crimes during the age of totalitarian dictatorship and total war have been offered. I think it is possible to identify at least common background structures of politics and violence during the Second World War, when the Axis, which was Germany's international coalition at that time, for a short time ruled approximately 1/3 of mankind. Since Germany, Italy, and Japan, the most important of the Axis states, not only initiated the wars, but were also responsible for the violence almost exclusively against foreigners, against foreign population, and against enemy POWs, it's necessary to focus on these years and on the empires which they were building during these wars. Nazi Germany murdered probably more than 11 million victims, the Japanese occupiers probably millions, and the Italian forces hundreds of thousands of victims. Among these three systems, it was almost only Germany which killed specific groups of its own citizens, especially the mentally ill, the Jews, and political enemies. All in all, approximately 500,000 men, women, and children. Nevertheless, more than 95% of the victims of Nazism were not Germans or Austrians. Thus, we cannot understand why this unprecedented violence evolved without understanding the empires, or how I would call them, the new empires of violence. All the three states mentioned were fundamentally expansionist, and their expansionism from the 1930s differed widely from the traditional colonial expansion of Western European states, and even of the newer imperialism by the United States. Of course, all three countries had been imperialist before the 1930s, starting in the late 19th century, when they as latecomers joined the imperialist system. While Germany lost its colonies after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, both Japan and Italy enjoyed a colonial continuity. So what was new about these empires, which were built during the 1930s and the early 1940s? The first fact is quite obvious, I think. The political systems of all three powers changed considerably. In Italy, Mussolini had taken over power already in 1922 and gradually installed his fascist dictatorship. Opinions vary whether this process was finished by 1926 or by 1929. In Germany, the political arena radicalized between 1929 and 1933 when Hitler took over, and in between 1 year he had firmly established the Nazi dictatorship. Japan's political system never changed completely, but was shattered by internal crisis, especially between 1932 and 1936, when a militarist authoritarian system was installed which, however, remained divided into internal factions until the end of the war. All three countries took an ultra-nationalist path, and they crushed all political opposition. For our understanding, the new discourses which dominated the public spheres are especially important. All three regimes considered their nations as races, on a more biological basis in the German case, and on a more cultural in the Italian and the Japanese cases. Germans, Italians, and Japanese were to be considered as the chosen people, or the master race, which was meant to dominate the continent. That is, Italian in the Mediterranean, Japan in East Asia, and Germany in most of Europe, and finally in the world. This was not just mere propaganda, but it was a radical vision within parts of the new elites, especially among the younger and middle generations. The empire was considered as an integral part of the renovation of the nation and the creation of new men. All three regimes aimed at mobilizing the whole population for these expansionist efforts, and they suppressed any critical discussion on the necessity and the actual handling of the empire. They developed these policies of expansion out of several reasons. Classical revisionism, that is, unmaking the 1919 peace treaties, was only meant to forge a basic consensus within the society and not a major goal. Both Italy and Japan wanted to continue their traditional colonial expansion and to revise the defeats they had suffered before. Italy, the disastrous battle against the Ethiopian army in Adwa in 1896. Japan, the failure of the so-called 21 demands of 1915. An effort to put pressure on the Chinese Republic in order to make northern China a Japanese protectorate during World War I. This was prevented by the Western powers. In Germany, a colonial movement aimed at regaining the African colonies during the 1920s. But Hitler and the Nazi leadership were not too interested in that. The foundation of new empire building lay somewhere else, both in the ultra-nationalist mission of the regimes and in the new context of the 1930s. More than anything else, the global economic crisis changed the international landscape, not only in an economic and social sense, but also in international relations and as a watershed of cultural discourses. The breakdown of international trade relations enhanced discussions on autarky and on the creation of separated trade regions centered around important economies. Great Britain and France oriented their trade relations more towards their colonial empires. While Great Britain thus created the so-called pound sterling bloc, making its empire the biggest transnational trade zone in the world, Japan soon built up a yen bloc with Taiwan, Korea, and from 1932 on Manchuria. Germany, on the other side, established close trade relations to Southeastern Europe during the Nazi years, thus implementing what they called the Reichsmark bloc. For example, 1938, Bulgaria exported nearly 50% of its foreign trade to the Reich. Some historians call Southeastern Europe, especially in the period after the German annexation of Austria in 1938, a German informal empire. The building spheres of influence were not restricted to economic matters. In Japan and Germany, the debate on Großraumwirtschaften, large space economies, was connected to a discussion on Großräume, large spaces, and on their implications for international relations and international law. Both Japan and Germany developed doctrines for their own zones of interest in order to prohibit other powers to intervene in their realm, like the Monroe Doctrine on the American continent. During the 1930s, under the conditions of the radical regimes, broader concepts of empires were developed. Mussolini, at the end of the 1920s, began to emphasize the cultural tradition of the Roman Empire in order to what he saw as reclaiming the Mediterranean as a mare nostrum. Somaliland, Eritrea, and the Dodecanese Islands and northern Libya were already by and large under Italian control, and Albania was largely dependent on Italy. From the mid-1930s on, the fascist empire was envisioned to include all of northeastern Africa, including Ethiopia, the Sudan, and Egypt, then under British hegemony. Thus, the attack on Ethiopia in 1935 was the starting point with his new empire building, now under the concept of spazio vitale, similar to this German Lebensraum, living space. In Japan, discussions about hegemony in China were not new in the 1920s, 1930s. They circulated especially among the officers which were already stationed in northern China and which officially had to protect Japanese enterprises in this region. But apparently a broad imperialistic discourse developed in Japan only after full intervention in Manchuria in 1931. It was the idea of Pan-Asianism, which had already widely circulated between 1905 and 1915, which now resurfaced as a new Japanese mission. More than in the Italian and the German cases, this was a discourse out of a perceived status of inferiority, and it was a discourse of liberation of the Asiatic people from Western domination. Japanese Pan-Asianism of the 1930s, 1940s was not just mere propaganda, but a very complex issue which was transformed from a traditional pan-ideology into a geopolitical concept. After the stalemate of the Japanese campaign in China, the war started in 1937 and more or less was stuck in 1938, the Japanese government classified its rule as the so-called New Order in East Asia, which was primarily meant for North China. And this was in 1940 expanded to the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The term, by the way, taken out of a more liberal context, which now was a geopolitical concept which also included Southeast Asia. Unlike the Nazi German and the fascist Italian approaches, the Japanese elites preferred models of indirect rule, with puppet governments like in Manchuria, the so-called Manchukuo state, but they only partially succeeded in making them operable during the war. In Germany, there were several parallel concepts for expansion developed during the 1930s. One was the above-mentioned Großraum, which was to include most of continental Europe as an economically based hegemony. The more famous is Hitler's Lebensraum, living space, a vision which he formulated in 1924, but was actually taken over from the German geographer Friedrich Latzel, who transformed this term from a biological concept into a geographical one. Hitler's version of Lebensraum remained unclear throughout. It focused on the conquest of the Soviet Union in order to ensure both economic exploitation of that country and Germanic settlement. During the mid-1920s, Hitler was quite isolated with his views. There were only very few proponents of a war against the Soviet Union. During the 1930s, however, this concept merged with another one, which became widespread among German elites, especially among German scholars. The German ethnic or ethnicity research, the German Volkstumsforschung, tried to identify all regions where ethnic Germans lived or where German cultural influences were allegedly visible. The so-called ethnic space, Volksboden, where Germans had lived, and the cultural space, the Kulturboden, where German cultural influence was allegedly visible. At the latest, from 1937 on, this discourse produced schemes of demographic resettlement for East Central Europe, which then, during the war, culminated into genocidal dimensions. All three expansionist discourses were considered as essential for the creation of a new society. The systems perceived themselves as young and dynamic, as opposed to the old traditional colonial empires like Great Britain and France. And all these schemes had major political and strategic implications. Italy envisaged to wage war against Great Britain in Egypt, Sudan, and Greece. The Japanese drive to the south meant an attack on most of the Western colonial powers, in the end, including the United States. Unlike common assumption, Hitler's basic war plan was not directed against Poland, but first against Czechoslovakia, and then against France. He actually planned to go together with Poland against the Soviet Union. Thus, almost every expansion implicated a major conflict, if not a global war. Yet, the creation of new imperialism started long before the Second World War. It is difficult to give an exact date. This is rather a gradual development between 1930 and 1939. The Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931 marked a decisive step towards dismantling the international post-war order. In the Asian case, these were the Washington Treaties of 1922. In Japan, the invasion is considered by some historians as the beginning of the so-called 15 Years' War, from 1931 to 1945, and by a few others even as the beginning of the Second World War, which would then stretch from 1931 to 1945. Nevertheless, it is hard to consider this as a decisive watershed between traditional colonial empire building and new imperialism. Japanese aspirations for Manchuria were not new. However, at that point, Japan broke out of the imperial consensus and for the first time met international criticism in the League of Nations. There are specific new features of Japanese imperialism, especially the enormous investment in the Manchurian economy. For the Japanese, Manchuria became a sort of paradise, the promised land for future development and settlement of Japanese colonists. It is, however, unclear whether Japanese rule in Manchuria, which was extended to other parts of northern China in 1932-33, already showed the patterns of the new imperialist violence. Chinese resistance in Manchuria was remorselessly suppressed. A major massacre of approximately 2,000 civilians in Pingdingshan town in 1932 is the most notorious. But Western historiography has not yet dealt in depth with Japanese structural anti-resistance warfare, for example, mass deportations in resistance area or the installation of strategic fortified villages, a tactic to expel the population in certain armed places. Some historians claim that more than 5 million inhabitants of Manchuria were forcibly relocated in that context until 1940. Similar patterns accompanied the last period of German colonial war in what is now called Libya, then the province of Cyrenaica. This, of course, was a continuation of the Italian campaign to conquer Libya, which had already started in 1911. In 1928, Italy, now fascist, proceeded to pacify and occupy the whole Cyrenaica, where it met fierce resistance. Especially from 1930 on, the fascist troops radicalized their warfare. Approximately 100,000 Bedouins were deported to desert camps, where a large portion of the inmates died, and around 12,000 real or alleged resistors were executed. General Badoglio, who led this warfare, in 1930 even deliberated about the wholesale extermination of the population in Cyrenaica. Thus, it is no wonder that some historians call the Cyrenaica pacification a genocide. Nevertheless, I think it is still necessary to compare all kinds of colonial warfare of the interwar period in order to identify the peculiarities of an alleged fascist style of war. The democratic colonial powers also periodically led colonial wars. The most spectacular colonial war of the time was led by Spain and France and Morocco, the so-called Rif War from 1921 to 1926. There, the colonial powers even used gas warfare against the population. In the discussion of a specific fascist form of warfare, The Abyssinian War of 1935-1936 has gained a central position. The Italian war against Ethiopia was not just another colonial conquest. It was led against one of the last independent and especially Christian states, a fully recognized member of the international community and within the League of Nations. For the first time, an enormous army of 500,000 men was deployed to subdue an African country. And Italian warfare was outspokenly ruthless, with the application again of gas warfare, killing of POWs, etc. Also, Italian rule afterwards violently suppressed all resistance until the British liberated Ethiopia in the context of the Second World War in 1941. According to the Ethiopian government, almost 300,000 inhabitants were killed outside the combat zones. Both the contemporaries and some historians have called the Abyssinian War the first fascist war of annihilation. There's a German book titled Der erste Vernichtungskrieg der Moderne, the first war of annihilation of modern times. Thus, pretending that this was a kind of precedent of what happened after the German attack on the Soviet Union in 1941. Nevertheless, differences to the systematic mass murder of certain segments of the population and the Soviet POWs are obvious. And future allies of Italy, both Germany and Japan, reacted rather ambivalently on the Abyssinian War. Hitler, of course, congratulated Mussolini for his military success, but he secretly had supported both sides with German arms. German commentators afterwards criticized the incoherent Italian racial policies in Africa during the occupation. And the Japanese reaction was even more mixed. Some Japanese commentators welcomed the power of a new fascist and young nations, somewhat similar to their own self-image. And of course, they greeted the blow against the League of Nations. But on the other hand, Japan had enjoyed close diplomatic relations with Ethiopia, and there was criticism that this is a new step in Western colonialism, which the Japanese in general were opposed to. But it was the Japanese military itself, soon in accordance with their political leadership, which launched the biggest conflict and racial war when the Japanese army fully invaded China after the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. After landing near Shanghai, Japanese troops started to kill civilians en masse during their advance along the Yangtze River. This brutal conquest culminated with the occupation of the Chinese capital of Nanjing in December 1937, which was followed by the probably largest massacre in a city during the conflicts of 1937 to 1945. Between 30,000 and 200,000 Chinese POWs and civilians were slaughtered in the so-called Rape of Nanjing. This mass murder was ordered and tolerated by the Japanese Army Officer Corps, in first place to exterminate all POWs and alleged Chinese soldiers who had sought civilian cover. But it was also extended to the whole civilian population, including women and children. Though the dimensions of these crimes can be called genocidal, and the famous Chinese-American author Iris Chang, in her famous book, has called them the Asian Holocaust, it is important to identify some features which were different from the German crimes, especially in occupied Eastern Europe. Neither was there a central order from Tokyo given, nor is there any proof of a premeditated genocidal plan. The same applies, by the way, to the Japanese massacre against Filipinos in the Manila area at the end of the war in 1945, with approximately similar victim figures. These crimes are rather to be interpreted in the context of the specific warfare of the Japanese military and its racist and expansionist nature. The violence should also be viewed in the context of the international relations and international law at that time. Between 1930 and 1941, all three Axis powers deliberately cut their international ties in order to build new ones with countries with similar systems, ethno-nationalist, expansionist, and anti-Western. For most of the time, a violent anti-communism can be added, though for a certain time, between September 1939 and June 1941, some, especially German and Japanese politicians, were considering a far-reaching integration of the Soviet Union into that system, the so-called Continental Bloc, from Berlin to Tokyo. Nevertheless, there was never a real coalition within the Axis. Hitler always was too suspicious about the so-called yellow race, and Italy declined to be a major power after 1941. The turn away from the League of Nations was clearly connected to the expansionist drive of all three powers, and in the long run, it was accompanied by the turn away from international law. Japan went ahead when in 1929 it signed the Geneva Protocols on the treatment of the POWs, but never had them ratified. But even after the withdrawal from the League of Nations, Japan was still integrated in a network of international relations and even hosted the International Red Cross Conference in 1934 in Tokyo. At this conference, a far-reaching convention about the protection of civilians was discussed but never finalized. The Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 on was officially designated as a China incident, Shinajiken, by the Japanese government, in order to avoid any obligations arising from international law, which would have applied to a proper war. Thus, Chinese POWs had no legal protections and were either released or killed. Mussolini, on the other hand, violated the 1925 Geneva Conventions on Gas Warfare in Ethiopia. And Nazi Germany issued an amnesty for war crimes after the German campaign in Poland. The amnesty was issued already in October 1939. And accompanying the SS and police members were at that time exempted from regular justice. And finally, in 1941-42, Germany lifted all restrictions towards the Soviet population for its war of annihilation. Similar orders were, by the way, given by Italian and Bulgarian high commands for their anti-partisan warfare in 1941 and 1942. It is obvious that these restrictions of applying international law were directed at specific groups of so-called racially inferior population. Jews and Roma in all German-occupied areas, Slavs in Poland, in the German-occupied Soviet Union and in Yugoslavia, but also the Chinese in the Japanese-occupied regions. Regarding Western civilian populations and POWs, international law was applied in Europe, but it was restricted within the Japanese Empire. Here the principle of reciprocity still played a role. Axis mass violence was indispensably connected to the war. War created a new state of emergency within these societies, a radical new war-related nationalism, and a high degree of acceptance of violence against enemies, both external and alleged internal ones. All three powers used specific forces to build and rule their empires, though in very different dimensions. Japan's empire was by and large administered by the military, which itself had a unique position within the political system. The same applies to a certain extent to major Japanese enterprises, which were active in the occupied countries. The actual policing of the subdued population was taken over by the rather tiny military police, both of the army and the navy, the infamous Kempeitai and the Tokutai. Most of the killings, however, were committed by Japanese regular ground forces, sometimes even by Navy personnel. Italy, on the other side, had also heavily relied on military administrations, with the exception of southern Slovenia. For the Abyssinian War, it deployed a major force of party militias, the so-called squadristi or black shirts. The German occupation relied on the by far biggest party and police structures, the SS and the different branches of the police, Gestapo or police. Nevertheless, even here the Wehrmacht played a major role in the violence against civilians, especially in the Soviet Union and in southeastern Europe. And it was responsible for the fate of the Soviet POWs. These specific structures corresponded to the types of violence under occupation, more kinds of war crimes in the traditional sense in the Italian and Japanese case, and unprecedented Nazi crimes in the German case. The German leadership was the only one among the three which developed distinct programs of extermination between 1939 and 1942. German politicians, experts, and administrators compiled memos or discussed in meetings mass murder in a unique dimension, starting in 1939 with a planned killing of more than 70,000 inmates of psychiatric institutions. During the core period of planning and murdering, that's from spring 1941 until spring 1943, the murder, deportation, or starvation of no less than 70 to 80 million Europeans was under internal debate. The starvation or flight of 30 million inhabitants of the Soviet Union, the Hunger Plan, the murder of more than 11 million European Jews, the Wannsee Conference, and the infamous Generalplan Ost, the General Plan East, which envisaged the deportation of 31 million Slavs. Nevertheless, it is important to keep in mind that a large part of the German crimes were similar to those of the other regimes, because they perceived and administered their empires in a similar way. Unlike traditional colonial policies, which aimed at allegedly uncivilized, undeveloped, or even unpopulated areas, the new empires were to include regions with developed infrastructures and political systems, with populations with strong national or cultural identities, or even major international powers like the Soviet Union. So both the ideas of a civilizing mission, which was so important, for example, for British colonialism, and some kind of colonial romanticism were almost absent here. On the contrary, it was expected that the occupiers would meet fierce resistance not only by the enemy military, but also by the population under occupation. For example, Poland, the Balkans, or China had a long tradition of self-organized resistance and militias. The Soviet Union was considered as the arch-enemy of mankind, and its population is seen as infested with Bolshevism. Thus, all three occupying regimes met any signs of resistance with almost identical patterns. They placed the population outside the rule of law and executed extreme retaliation for sabotage and attacks on occupying troops or functionaries. To begin with, there was an assassination attempt on the Italian governor in Ethiopia, Rodolfo Graziani, also called the Hangman of Africa, in February 1937. As a retaliation, thousands of Ethiopians were killed, including almost 500 clerics of a Christian monastery. In May 1941, the German military administration in Serbia published a warning that for every assassinated German soldier, 100 locals would be killed. The victim statistic for the German anti-partisan warfare in the occupied Soviet Union runs to up 500,000 killed, among them less than 10% partisans. But probably the most radical strategy was applied by the Japanese North China Army in 1941-1943 against Mao's partisans in the regions west and south of Beijing, a strategy that was called by the Chinese the three alls: kill all, burn all, loot all. According to Chinese statistics, which however have to be used with caution, more than 2 million Chinese died during the Japanese raids. Another very similar strategy on the German and Japanese side was the creation of so-called dead zones, tote Zonen, partisan areas completely emptied of population, which was either expelled, deported for forced labor, or killed. This reminds us again of the Italian strategy in the Cyrenaica in 1930-1941. All three occupation powers established their own camp systems, though none was as widespread and ruthless as the German one, and the Gulag. Germany installed approximately 15,000 camps, including the smallest branches, it was probably more than 40,000 according to the new research of the US Holocaust Memorial. There were hundreds of camps in the Italian occupied zones, predominantly in Yugoslavia and North Africa, And Japan apparently started to establish camp systems after the Pearl Harbor attack for POWs, but also for the internment of Western personnel in the colonies, and Western settlers in the colonies. Certain groups of POWs suffered a terrible fate under Axis rule. The Wehrmacht, as I mentioned, is responsible for the mass starvation of at least 2.5 million Soviet POWs and the direct murder of more than 150,000 of them. The Japanese army obviously did not keep a POW system during the war in China. Thus, they either killed them or set them free. Numbers are totally unclear. Only after the beginning of the war against the West in late 1941, the Japanese started to set up POW camps and treated both Western and Asian captured soldiers in an inhuman fashion. The central feature of Axis occupation was economic exploitation. The unfinished war, from the perspective of the occupiers, made it necessary to squeeze out as much out of the occupied countries as possible. Both Germany and Japan started with policies of indirect exploitation, attracting a low-wage workforce and devaluating the currencies of the occupied countries. Beginning 1942, both Japan and Germany turned to a more coercive labor policy in the occupied territories. Laborers from German-occupied Europe were deported to the Reich, and especially those from Eastern Europe kept under humiliating and inhuman conditions. The Japanese administration deported forced laborers primarily not to their home country, to Japan, but to other regions under occupation. Those Chinese who were apprehended during the anti-partisan warfare in North China were sent to Manchuria, the coal mines. Indonesians were sent from their homes as so-called Romusha to the railway construction projects in Burma and Borneo, where tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of them died, along with their British comrades as depicted in the famous film Bridge on River Kwai. In the context of these policies of exploitation, Axis powers were also responsible for major famines with millions of victims. But it was only the German leadership which actually developed a famine scenario for the war against the Soviet Union in order to feed the Wehrmacht out of Soviet agriculture. It was envisaged to reduce the number of inhabitants by 30 million, the so-called hunger plan, but these plans were actually never fully put into practice. Both Soviet POWs and especially the city dwellers died en masse during 1941-1943. The Japanese, however, transformed agriculture in Southeast Asia. This led to major famines at the end of the war, in Indonesia and in Vietnam in 1944-1945. In the latter died between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese from hunger. Anti-partisan warfare in North China also led to a collapse of agriculture and a famine in the above-mentioned areas. Though in different dimension, these policies and also their effects were similar under all Axis regimes. I would argue that they were all the consequences of this new empire building. But the specific crimes of the regimes, especially the German ones, are more indirectly related to the empire building, but they are related. This is most obvious in the first systematic killing programs of German occupation, the murder of the so-called Polish intelligentsia or Polish elites in 1939-1940, which started even earlier than the other killing programs, the so-called euthanasia, the killing of mentally ill. Unlike the latter, there's almost no Western research on the killing of about 50 to 60,000 members of the Polish elites and Polish organization. This was a kind of preventative mass murder, which meant to destroy all Polish identities and Polish ability to resist. There is no similar case among the other Axis regimes. There is one in the Soviet case with Katyn. Nevertheless, in early 1942, the Japanese occupiers in Singapore and Mid-Malaya killed tens of thousands of expatriate Chinese who were suspected of supporting the Chinese war effort against Japan. These so-called Sukching massacres can be considered as the only systematic Japanese mass murders, which were planned, unlike Nanjing. When the Japanese occupiers suspected an uprising, which was the case in West Kalimantan in early 1943, they did not hesitate to kill the local elite families. During the so-called Pontagnac incidents, between 2,000 and 20,000 locals were shot until June 1944. The numbers are still unclear. While there is no comparative case of killings of the mentally ill under Italian or Japanese rule, the Japanese experiments on humans are infamous. In occupied China, the Japanese military medical service killed thousands of local Chinese after using biological and chemical weapons on them. Parts of the German experiments on inmates of concentration camps were undertaken with the same cruelty for military purposes, probably out of the same amoral research interests. And of course, there is no parallel to the murder of European Jews in Roma. Fascist Italy joined the anti-Jewish persecution after 1938, but it never fully participated in the mass murder of Jews. Parts of the Italian military even helped to save persecuted Jews in the Italian-occupied zones in France, in Yugoslavia, and Greece. And though there were some Japanese proponents of anti-Semitism, and the Japanese military even asked German institutions for ideological instructions on anti-Semitism, sent us some material, a specific anti-Jewish policy never materialized. The famous immigrant ghetto in occupied Shanghai shows this unsympathetic, but I think not persecutory role of the Japanese in this context. In Germany, on the other hand, the so-called Jewish question moved to the center not only of Nazis in state policies, but also in public discourses. The Nazi leadership and its core followers were obsessed with the idea of a so-called Jewish world conspiracy, in that they were thus leading a war not only against hostile countries, but against Jewry in general. With Hitler, you can see this. He was always thinking, like, when I'm having warfare against the Jews in the Kremlin, against the Jews in Wall Street, and the Jews behind Churchill. That's inextricable. Hence, politics and strategy were entangled with anti-Semitic perceptions, and the so-called solution of the Jewish question was looked for long before war and expansion begins, but it was radicalized. The dynamics of anti-Jewish policies cannot be explained without the background of Nazi empire building. After the attack on Poland in 1939, a large minority of 2 million Polish Jews came under German rule, another million under Soviet Union. These were considered by the occupiers not only as an ideological enemy, but also an obstacle for the occupation policies. Jews were declared responsible for all negative symptoms of occupation life, like rising black market prices, spreading diseases, anti-Jewish rumors, etc., etc. In a certain sense, this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, since the German occupation policy drove Polish Jewry to the margins of society, creating itself the problems which they attributed to the Jewish minority. Soon, German administrators were willing to get rid of this minority on the basis of the experience they already had with the mass murder of Polish elites and mentally ill. Consequently, the attack on the Soviet Union, which was perceived as a Judeo-Bolshevik system, led to the immediate mass murder, which itself opened the doors for universal wholesale killing of European Jews. The so-called Jewish question was also an important element for German relations to other Axis states, the smaller ones, especially Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, and Bulgaria. All governments were willing to expropriate their Jewish minority, most of them to deport them from their occupation areas. Especially the Romanian government used German empire building to murder the Jews in Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, similar, by the way, to Croatian Ustasha. The Roma minorities, however, were not at all at the center of German policies, but were nevertheless sucked up in the maelstrom of German extermination policies. Croatia and Romania almost independently deported or killed the Roma in their realm, in order to create an ethnically homogeneous society without them. The Holocaust cannot be explained out of the new radical empire building, but its dynamics were closely related to it. To put it briefly, It is rather improbable that without German empire building in the East, there would have been such a crime against humanity. When I'm talking about the extreme mass violence during the 1930s and 1940s, you probably expect to hear more about Stalinist crimes. And indeed, Stalinist crimes occurred almost in parallel to the Axis violence. And parts of them took place in the same area as Nazi crimes, as Timothy Snyder has underlined. Though the Soviet Union during the 1930s and 1940s can be considered an empire, the logics of the new radical empire building, as I tried to outline it, explains much less in the Soviet case. In a certain sense, it was the establishment of the Soviet Union, the expansion of Soviet Russia between 1918 and 1921, which clearly showed the interaction of empire building and violence. The Russian Civil War, as it is somehow imprecisely called, was accompanied by unprecedented violence, especially from the Bolshevik side, but also to a lesser degree by the so-called Whites and the Greens, the independent forces. Specific types of violence, like the campaign against the Don Cossacks, can be considered as imperial crimes. All in all, the situation was, however, rather different, with a complicated structure of a civil war with several foreign interventions, and with different ramifications than those between 1930 and 1945. There is no doubt that major Stalinist crimes included some imperial elements, like the artificial famine of 1932-1933, which was primarily directed at the nationalities in the south, predominantly the Ukrainians and the Kazakhs. All the so-called nationality operations during the Great Terror in 1937-38, targeting Poles, Koreans, or Soviet Germans and other groups. Nevertheless, nearly all of these campaigns also affected areas in the Russian Federation proper: the hunger, the collectivization, the Great Terror. The interaction with empire building, I think, is clearly visible during the Soviet westward expansion of 1939-1940, which was accompanied by the mass murder of Polish POWs in Katyn and elsewhere, which is a clear parallel to the German intelligentsia murders, somewhat more west. Similar to the German policies in Poland, the Stalinist police deported so-called undesirable elements from the newly annexed territories in the same years, 39-41, and in 43-44, the so-called unreliable nationalities from the Caucasus and the Crimea. The second Soviet empire building, the conquest of East Central Europe in 1944-1945, was again accompanied by violence, though rather rarely by mass murder. Most similar to the Axis cases are the Soviet campaigns against the armed underground in the annexed territories and in Poland. Probably hundreds of thousands of locals were shot under the pretext of retaliation. Nevertheless, the empire building was but one factor explaining Stalinist violence, but not the underlying framework like for the crimes of the Axis states. Unlike Stalinism, the fate of unoccupied China during the 1930s and 40s is only rarely mentioned in the descriptions of mass violence during these decades. One of the longest conflicts in China, the civil war between the Kuomintang, the central political forces, and the communists between 1927 and 1949, with a major break inside, fell in this, you can call it, Eurasian period of mass violence. For example, between 1927 and 1934, several hundred thousand, if not more than a million Chinese fell victim to it. And again, the same number after the continuation of the Civil War, after 1945. The Chinese Civil War had apparently only few features of empire building at the end of the war, when the communists were entering Tibet and Xinjiang. But they gave way to a new wave of extreme Maoist terror, especially between 1949 and 1951, founding terror in China. Thus, at a time when mass violence was on the retreat in Europe, a new period of terror started in Asia, lasting all in all until around 1970 in China, and as you know, until 1979 in Cambodia. If we turn back to sum up, we can observe how three late-coming colonial powers started to establish new radical wartime empires, which lasted sometimes only for some years. These empires perceived themselves both as a continuation and a discontinuation of 19th century imperialism. They were based on racism, on collaboration, they were aiming at exploitation, and they were using pieces of an existing colonial discourse. Actually, these empires differed greatly from their predecessors. They were based on forcibly aligned societies with a radical nationalist discourse and were driven by project to transcend traditional mankind by a new imperialist man. The empires were meant both anti-communist and anti-Western. The major novelty was a new kind of border imperialism, conquering neighboring states with similar structures and societies, which were, however, considered in most cases as inferior or even subhuman. Conquering developed civilization required both the use of enormous economic and military resources and entailed conflict with fierce local resistance, thus a higher necessity for violence and legitimization out of the perpetrator perspective. The new empires were based on a fragmentation of the international system, on the establishment of separate economy zones for autarky, on the restriction of international law. They relied on a new global structure, the Axis, which for a short time ensured the isolation of Great Britain and the United States. The new empires were based on an unprecedented scale of exploitation and violence, especially regarding societies considered as inferior or infected with communism. Hunger was considered a tool to occupy territory or to pacify regions. The modern war industries required an enormous workforce. Millions of men and women were deported for forced labor. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were killed during anti-resistance warfare or in camps. And millions of POWs were killed or starved to death. Both the Holocaust and the murder of Roma unfolded in the context of empire building, especially during the two wars against Poland and against the Soviet Union. The empires failed. They were not able to establish stable structures or to overcome the resistance. Instead, they lay in pieces in 1945. But most of European Jewry under German hegemony had almost completely been exterminated. Almost 1/3 of mankind, 700 million people, lived for a shorter or longer time within these empires, not counting the home fronts of the Axis states. The Axis was about to rule a major part of the world, Europe, Asia, and Africa. We were lucky that they didn't succeed. But I think it is necessary to repeatedly reevaluate this global crisis of the 1930s and 1940s. And I hope that future research will be able to take a more intense comparative look at the violence of the 1930s and 1940s, and will open new perspectives on interpretations and understanding. I thank you for your attention.